to the launch of CPRE's new report on local green space. I'm Sarah McMonagall and I'm Head of External Affairs at CPRE, and I'll be chairing the discussion this morning. It's actually our first event of this year, so we're very excited. I think we've got over 130 people registered to attend, so that's brilliant, and that's a really good mix of civil servants and MPs, lots of sector stakeholders and representatives from CPRE's fantastic network of local groups. When you consider the panel we have for you this morning, it's no surprise that we've managed to attract so many people to attend. So speaking today, we have Joanna Avery, who is Chief Planner at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. Victoria Ekbo, who is the founder of Footsteps, which is a Black women's hiking group in the Northwest. We have Baroness Hayman, who is the Shadow Minister for the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And my colleague Madeline Gohan, who is our planning officer at CPRE and the person who actually undertook the research. Well, one of the reasons we're so excited about the event today is the timing. And when we actually started thinking about this back in November, we didn't realise we were going to be launching it on the actual day that the Levelling Up white paper was published. So that is a big stroke of luck, and not down to anyone in the team being psychic. But it's also more broadly a really exciting time for planning, because this year we're expecting a review of the National Planning Policy Framework. And we're also expecting to see some planning related legislation coming forward at some point, whether that's a planning bill or a levelling up bill, but there will be planning related legislation on the way. So it's a really good time to come together and talk about how planning is working, what's working well and what could work even better. But in terms of local green space, I hadn't personally heard of it before. I had conversations with my planning policy colleagues at CPRE. And I do wonder how many of you might say the same. So in terms of a lay person's intro, it was something that was introduced in 2012. And essentially it gives local communities the opportunity to protect a small patch of green space near to where they live that they value for some reason. And it actually came from kind of a high level commitment from Cameron and Clegg under the coalition agreement. And to be fair, like credit where credit's due, it's actually been a big success for the government, and you'll hear more about that from Madeline in a few minutes. But when we come together at these sorts of events, we're always very quick to emphasise the health and well-being benefits of spending time in local green space and nature and the countryside, and that's particularly the case since we all suffered through the lockdowns and the pandemic. But I don't think we talk enough about the inequality to local green space and countryside. And that's what we're really keen to highlight today. So that inequality particularly exists for poorer communities and people of colour. And we at CPRE passionately believe in a countryside for all, including those small patches of green, which arguably are much more important than national parks and AONBs, because they're near to where people live, so they're able to use them, regularly on a regular basis. That's probably enough from me, but just wanted to say a few words on housekeeping before we kick off. So if you could all keep your mics on, that would be great. Mics off even, so we don't have any background noise. And in terms of how we're going to run the Q&A, if you could type your questions in the chat box, that would be great. But do remember to include your name and organisation so we can get a sense for who's in the virtual room. In the same vein, it'd be great if you could all put your name and organisation on your Zoom name so we can kind of easily scan across and see who's joined us this morning. In terms of the questions, you can start typing them now. If you've already thought of something you'd like to ask the panel, you don't need to ask or wait for the panelists to actually finish speaking. I'll be posing the questions in batches of 3 so we can try and get through as many as possible. And finally, just on social, we really like to have kind of a parallel debate on social while we're having our event. So if you are on Twitter, feel free to tweet about the discussion this morning using our Twitter handle, which is simply @CPRE and the hashtag #LocalGreenSpace. And finally, the event is being recorded, so we'll have that up on our YouTube in the next couple of days. And if you really enjoy it, you can watch it again at the weekend. But yeah, that's it from me. So if we could start by handing over to Madeline, who's going to talk you through the research.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here and to have the opportunity to tell you a bit more about this new research. We chose to focus on this designation because since it's been introduced in the National Planning Policy Framework, or NPPF, in 2012, it has remained a weirdly well-kept secret of the planning system. And that's a big shame because it's a very powerful tool that can do a lot to ensure that everyone has secured access to nature on their doorstep. Just to give you a little background on what it entails, it essentially gives the same level of protection as greenbelt or national parks to smaller patches of green space that are close to where people live and that are particularly valued by local communities. For example, because of their beauty, their historic significance, their recreational value, their tranquility, or the richness of their wildlife. To use this designation, local people can submit evidence either during the preparation or the review of their local plan or of their neighborhood plan. What makes it particularly powerful and useful to local people is that it implies that being particularly valued by its local community is in itself a reason strong enough to protect a given space from getting lost to development. That means that it gives local people the power to make sure that their community can rely on the existing green space they care about most and feel confident that it will still be around in the future. But despite all these benefits, there are relatively very few people who know about this tool as we speak. There's no national register of designated local green spaces, and most local authorities don't refer to it in their own local plans and in other means of communication. That's why we chose to focus on this designation, and this report is the first extensive study to really look into it. By going through all made neighborhood plans and adopted local plans, we found that 6,515 spaces have been protected under this designation across England since its introduction in 2012. That's great because it shows that the designation corresponds to tangible need among local communities. And it also confirms how much people who do know about the designation value this opportunity. However, our analysis also revealed strong disparities in the use of this designation across England. We found that there are close to 2 times as many local green spaces designated in the south and over 3 times as many designated in the Midlands as there are in the north. Also, while there's been a good take-up of the designation in rural areas, there's considerable scope for more of these spaces to be designated in urban areas where most of the population lives and where people also tend to have least access to wider parts of the countryside. These disparities broadly correlate with the spread of main neighborhood plans across the country, and that makes sense because we found that 83% of local green spaces have been designated in neighborhood plans. To address these disparities and help maximize and broaden the use of this designation, we're asking the government to retain, reinforce, and further support neighborhood planning, especially in the north and in urban areas. Local authorities should also be encouraged to promote the use of this designation in their area, especially as a means to support local strategic policy aims. We're also asking the government to introduce compulsory standards for access to nature into planning law and policy, and to add an indicator on access to nature to the index of multiple deprivation. This would help facilitate targeted support and level up access to nature for all. Finally, our recommendations also include a number of amendments to the NPPF and its associated guidance, which would all help clarify and improve some of the aspects of its designation and thus facilitate its appropriate use. We'd really like to see some of these recommendations taken forward as part of the upcoming planning bill and the review of the NPPF. As the first analysis of its kind, the primary aim of this report is to raise awareness of the local green space designation and understanding of what it can achieve. We really hope it will bring this powerful tool into the spotlight for local communities, for local authorities, and for national government, so that a lot more of these spaces can be protected, especially in areas that need it most. Thank you.
Thanks, Madeline. That was a really great overview of the report. Next, we're going to hear from Victoria. Over to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I was quite surprised when I was contacted, but pleasantly so. I do quite a bit with CPRE, and I continue to say that they're my favorite charity, and I'll do anything for them, yet within the boundaries, of course. What strikes me most about this designation is not just the fact that it's something that I didn't know. No one I've spoken to in the last few weeks knows about. I mean, people that are very much campaigners of for the environment, members of the Ramblers, I mean, you know, historical campaigners for the environment, itinerant hikers, no one does. But I am excited about it, and I am quite happy that this is happening now when we are faced with, you know, the reality, but a very close reality of what our local green spaces mean. Footsteps was started over lockdown. And you can imagine at the time when we couldn't travel to national parks and or into the countryside to take a walk, our local green spaces became an oasis, and that's the only space we had access to. For women in my community and for myself personally, all the tiny little dotted green spaces around here became a lifesaver. And I mean, we continue to say within the community that if not for these places, we would have seen quite a lot of tragedy among members of the community. So we started basically by inviting, I personally used to go out every morning as a way of managing my own mental health, you know, for a walk, for a run, but increasingly, you know, realized that not many other people were doing that in my community. And it was really a thing of going to knock on doors to say, I haven't seen you, haven't heard from you, come along. I'm going for a walk this time, and then starting to form a group of women that texted each other to say, I'm going for a walk this time, do you want to come along? Now, having a local green space to do that makes it possible for us to even be able to say, I'm going for a walk, come along. If you imagine that quite a lot of women in the Black community work in the NHS, so people that work shifts, people that work long hours, people that work strange days, weekends, etc. So time is a thing that people don't have, you know, that managing family, you know, responsibilities, and in the middle of the pandemic, managing a pandemic. And what we began to notice was that people with increasing pressure on their work life and family life as a result of lockdowns were not being supported. They were not being, I don't know, protected, so to speak. And being able to say, you know, when you're off work, you know, when you're coming off that night shift, meet me at the small park next to the house or the playing field. Let's just take a few steps around, made a huge difference. It's often interesting that conversations around local green spaces forget that it's not just about you know, that access being there, but it's about real people and real people that affect our lives. So imagine the nurses that took care of all the sick people in the hospital during the pandemic and continue to do so. Imagine all the doctors, imagine all the teachers, imagine all the paramedics, you know, people that take your bins at 6 o'clock in the morning. I was woken up by the binman this morning at 6. So these people are the real people that affect our lives on a daily basis. they're the ones that need to go out for a walk in the middle of the afternoon, when they come off a night shift, when they come off a day shift. If they are not healthy, they cannot take care of us. They cannot do the work they have to do. They cannot teach our children properly. No, people forget that there is a ripple effect to just a tiny plot of land, a field in a neighborhood in northern Liverpool, and the work that is done at all the general hospitals in Liverpool. This effect, these links are there, and they are strongly felt when people don't work effectively. Another thing I would like to focus on today is the place of these local green spaces in the education of the local community. If we think that our schools are increasingly classroom bound, our young people's and adults experience of nature is through stuff done on iPads and computers. Our local green spaces provide the opportunity for our children, women in the community, everyone to experience the changing seasons. What birds come to the field, to the park, in what season, what changes in what season, the leaves, the ground, the moss on the trees, etc. Without these spaces, we don't have that. We have young people's experience of concrete pathways and buildings and classrooms, a few hedges, flower hedges, and that is it. And when we talk about, again, I'm talking about the ripples, we talk about integration. People that move from countries have got a totally different climate, totally different landscape, and come to live in our cities and do not experience what happens because they live in the middle of the city, and there's no green space around them. Therefore, the conversations that I had around preservation, the conservation, changing seasons, there's no real understanding of what really happens because people don't live close enough or do not experience this from lack of having a green space next to them. So there is a lot of a lot that we gain from preserving our local green spaces, from making sure that they are not taken away and other buildings not put on top of it. And I mean, even the practical things like safety. And we're talking about this a few days ago with members of the group, where one of them lives in an area where the playing field is being developed, and they didn't realize that it was his field, that it was part of the planning permission. And she said, well, that goes my local walking place because I can't go to the big park when I finish work because it's too dark, it's too late, and I don't feel safe. Again, this is something we hear over and over again. These small places are safer places for local people. They are, first of all, they are local, they're close to where they live, and they don't have to go far. Women who we usually feel quite vulnerable outside, I mean, if we haven't been listening to the news recently, all the attacks on women recently, just going for a walk, going for a run. And of course, pets, children being encouraged to go out, walk their pets in the evening. The local space provides that space. I am looking forward to seeing how this tool can empower my community. I am looking forward to seeing how we can use it to hold my local council accountable, and to encourage members of my community to engage with local development. Thank you.
Thanks, Victoria. Yeah, that was a really powerful reminder of why these local green spaces matter so much to people, and why we need to be campaigning for more people to be taking up local green space and making better use of them. So thank you for that. So next we're going to go to Baroness Sue Hayman, who would rather be called Sue, who is the Shadow Levelling Up Minister. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting to hear. I think one of the things I'd like to say is, to me, it's really the right time for this report to have come out, and the right time to be having these conversations for a number of reasons, partly from what Victoria was just talking about, which is how the pandemic really has, I guess, shone a spotlight on what we already knew, which is that we all benefit from greater access to green open spaces. It's not just about the physical health benefits, it's about the therapeutic mental health benefits, the feeling of well-being when you're out in the open, and also that understanding of nature and the seasons that Victoria talked about. And I think one of the things that struck me as well, and again that came through from the pandemic, is how very important this is for our towns and cities, for our urban spaces. I mean, I live in Cumbria. I'm very lucky. I have a lot of green around me when I'm at home. And the difference between my access during the pandemic to continue to see the countryside compared with my daughter's, for example, who's in Brighton stuck in a third floor flat, was so stark. And it really shows you that the importance of everyone having that access, and particularly for our health. But it's also the right time to have the conversation because of the other things that have been discussed, like the fact the national planning policy statement is going to be looked at, the fact that we are likely to have some kind of planning legislation, whether it is the long promised planning bill or something else. Last year I was working on the Environment Bill in the Lords, as well as being the main spokesperson for DLUC. I'm also a kind of secondary spokesperson for DEFRA in the Lords. And green space and planning and land use was something that was discussed by the Lords in the Environment Bill because of that importance of environment to everybody, to the general population. And we were told that that wasn't the right place for it, that we should be looking at this when the planning legislation comes out. So there is a real crossover from the two departments, from DLUC and from DEFRA. And I do straddle both, which I find particularly interesting because it gives me a real insight into how they influence each other, and how you have to have those green insights and those green objectives, if you like, when you're looking at making planning legislation, because the planning system is constantly banning competing interests for land use. And it's really important that the voices of local people are heard when that's being looked at. And I think Victoria demonstrated why very, very clearly. So to me, we absolutely need to, at the heart of our planning system, integrate environmental considerations so that we don't destroy those deep green spaces, that we don't lose that kind of important biodiversity in the centre of our towns and cities. And I think one of the things that struck me when I read the report, and it was mentioned at the beginning by Madeleine, is how the green space designations have been well taken up in some areas, very well taken up in some areas, but they're often in the more rural areas, they're in the more affluent areas in the south. And we really need to now, I think, see how we can push the government to promote the designation to areas, to local authorities that really could benefit greatly, but at the moment are simply not aware of those opportunities or how to go about it. And the same as local people, you aren't going to push for this in a local community if you're not aware that it exists and this is something that you can benefit from. So I think we all need to think about, how can we do that? I mean, people like me as politicians, how do we talk to the government about promoting this? What do we need to do in our own communities to bring awareness about? So because it's really important that we get our planning right in the future, and that when we do get the planning legislation to discuss, that it genuinely considers the importance of protecting green spaces where they're needed most. I mean, inequality is talked about a lot in the report. And again, that's something that we really need to look at. And this isn't just about planning, it's also about culture. It's about encouraging people who perhaps aren't used to going out and walking and spending time in the countryside. It's about how you encourage that. And I think working with schools, again, is an important part of that. I know in Cumbria, where I am, the Forestry Commission arranges for schools to go over and take the children from the poor areas, from the urban areas. But again, that's not always easy, because often the parents can't afford to pay the cost of those sorts of trips. So we need to look at it much more broadly and see what we can do to encourage more and more people to get out in the countryside, protect the areas that make it easier for them to get into those green spaces in urban communities. Because if we can get planning right, so we get the protected green spaces with the right kind of housing and infrastructure around it, we can have really good, strong, healthy communities. But if we lose them, you go down a completely different route. And we know that often it's much easier and more straightforward for developers to build on those green spaces than it is to either look at restoring brownfield sites, or actually looking at their planning in a different way, which again is why it's really important that it's part of any kind of local planning decision making, and that the community is also involved. There's also been a lot of talk in government about green infrastructure strategies, and the green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, as it's sometimes called. Again, that needs to be all part of our forward thinking about how we encourage the preparation of evidence-based plans that looks at opportunities for improving the area in this way, as well as just protecting it. So I think I'd just like to finish by saying that the pandemic really has increased our appreciation of what's needed. It gives us an opportunity to lobby government, to lobby ministers about why they need to now work more strongly with local authorities. Clearly, the Levelling Up paper's out today. That needs to be part of it. It needs to be part of how we level up our communities. Again, the report clearly demonstrates how the areas that benefited the most from these designations are the areas that actually really need them the least. I'm not saying that we don't all need them, but it's about ensuring that, again, some areas don't get left behind, which unfortunately seems to happen more and more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sue. Yeah, it's great that you can come at this with your kind of shadow DEFRA and shadow levelling up hats on. And yeah, we couldn't agree with you more in terms of the need to integrate environmental considerations more into our planning system. And that's certainly something we're going to be pushing for over the next year. Okay, so last but not least, I'd like to go to Joanna Avery now, who is Chief Planner at the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. And yeah, massive thanks to Joanna for joining us this morning on what is probably quite a bonkers day at the department. So yeah, we really appreciate your time. Over to you, Joanna.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. I just want to echo probably quite a lot of the comments and contributions we've already had this morning. But first of all, a word of thanks to CPRE. Planning policy and how we manage our built and our natural environments, those that are planned and those that are truly natural, is the combination of many efforts from many people, and also as we evolve policy and we evolve practice to deal with today and tomorrow's challenges. The contributions and the careful considerations that are put into the report are really help us sort of think through the days ahead and the policies ahead. I just wanted to sort of give you a few reflections, to start off with a personal one, which I think in part answers one of the questions in the chat, and then to sort of talk about sort of some of the current policy things that are in play at the moment, which I think sort of sets local designations in its broader context. So I'm going to go back to 1991. I was a planner. I was starting work, and my first project was called Open Space Planning in London. And for many people on the call will recall, when you used to do data entry, it was either a 1 or a 0. And I did the data entry on 1,100, I think it was, 1,134 surveys of every single public space in London and all the entries that came in from every borough. And through that work, it was a genuinely comprehensive look at every single green space in the city, from the big metropolitan spaces right down to very local environments. And so the question in the chat was, why has London not got local designations, or maybe not as many? I don't know for a fact, but I would suggest it might be because a lot of spaces are already accounted for within the planning system, and that's a great thing. And it also just very much talks to Sue's point, which is that, you know, our public space, our streets, our blue and green infrastructure should all be in our minds as we plan. Both those formal spaces, but also increasingly those informal spaces. So what I'm sort of, I suppose, and what that work also did, which I'm going to touch on a little bit, is actually talk about access and proximity to public space. And it wasn't wholly new thinking, but it was revisiting and resetting that approach to how you talk about catchments for public spaces and how you identify places which, and communities and neighbourhoods that didn't have really access to any public space of any size. So that ability to look at things at that sort of spatial level and that community level. We'll come back to that topic in a minute. So just to sort of say, you know, the power of the plan, the data, the analysis, the understanding of place, and then moving from, which this conversation is about, moving from that understanding to then sort of appreciating and planning for and maintaining the public space we've got is obviously really important. I also just echoed the personal observation about the importance of access to public space for all our well-being. I don't think I could have got through lockdown in any state at all had it not been access to. I'm very lucky to have access to a local park, which even has ducks and geese and swans on a little mini lake. And the changing seasons were really important to me, and the ability just to sort of march around the park once a day. And I think that need will probably continue for many of us. This isn't a sort of a need that will diminish. I think we're all acutely aware of our access to nature, and that bird song we so enjoyed at the beginning of lockdown and listened to and realised was important to us. All those sort of those gentle things, and the fact that there's a cherry tree on the street. You know, these are all sort of part of our sort of own personal well-being, and actually how we value our environments, but actually how we actually look after ourselves more generally. And so I sort of really endorse what others have said about that from a personal perspective. So what have we been doing? Well, obviously, the research itself really looks at the particularities of the take-up of local designation, and I think the research speaks for itself, and that it is probably quite a sort of patchy picture. And I think we as a department are very conscious of how different communities take up policy opportunities and planning opportunities in different ways, and that is sometimes based on people's capacity to get involved in conversations, and that's why we continue to support neighbourhood planning and fund the preparation and support for neighbourhood planning across the country. You know, that's a very undiminished, if not even more strengthened, objective for us as a department, a Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. One of our driving ambitions is that, particularly as we sort of modernise the planning processes and systems, I'm sure many people involved in this conversation this morning have probably been engaging with other people, their communities, their neighbours, their friends, their families in completely new ways over the last 2 years. We found digital platforms, ways of communicating, both professionally and as communities, which have actually helped us keep connected, and sometimes help us make us more connected and more informed about certain things that are going on around us and things that are important to us. So one of the things we're doing and very actively doing is looking at how a modernisation of how digital data, but also digital platforms, can give communities a greater voice and a greater say in how the environments around them are changing. Through a lot of work that's already live in our digital space, we're looking to see how, for example, simple things of putting a planning application in can be much easier, much simpler, much less open to sort of, just little common mistakes and things like that. And if people are interested in that in particular as an early bit of work, you might want to look at Bops and Ripper, sort of strange names, but some of the work we're doing, for example, with Southwark and Lambeth and Buckinghamshire at the moment. But that's sort of quite a technical area of how you use digital, but obviously we're all using digital platforms to do engagement. An anecdote tells us that through lockdown, as people moved away from or augmented engagement with not just having a room and some boards and a conversation, but actually going online, that a much broader range of people were engaging, for example, in individual projects and applications, and a whole suite of voices were being heard in those conversations. So not just more numbers of people engaging, but actually a much more diverse set of voices coming forward, and that can only be a good thing. So just a few things just to reflect on. One thing that's very much within this department's activities, and one thing that, to Sue's point, is very much being led by Natural England, so linking across to DEFRA and colleagues there. So colleagues will have seen last summer we launched the updates to the National Planning Policy Framework, and as part of that we launched the National Model Design Code. That's live in the planning system now. I would just, if colleagues haven't had a chance to look at it, I'd really commend it to you. It's a way to, it's a document that you can use as a very live tool to help you as communities, as groups, as individuals, think through the issues that are important to you. Design coding is a process by which a local authority, a community, can start to strategize about the things that are important to them, to understand the character of place that they have now, and how change, whether that's in public space, in development, in the role and purpose of streets, actually how that can be shaped and how standards can be set. And within the National Model Design Code, it's split into two parts. The first part is about sort of the process, which is absolutely strongly driven by engagement. And the second part of the document sort of gives you really great references as to the sort of things to think through. And really importantly in there are the elements of how we plan for public space and think about that. And I would just sort of commend that particular section to you, because it talks about all these, the need to really understand the role and function of different public spaces in our urban environments. We have different spaces that often deliver multiple functions to multiple people, and they are very varied in scale, and they're also very varied in literally the landscape that they contain, and also increasingly, communities getting involved in their management. So that understanding of that richness and role of purpose in public space is really important. And then, as we sort of said, starting to consider how that adds up to, as Sue was saying, the green and blue infrastructure of where we live and how we live. And the other thing I would just really commend to you is fantastic work published by Natural England, which is the Green Infrastructure Framework, and going right back to those early days in '91 when it was a paper-based survey and we were having to map things on plans, and there wasn't any digital mapping. You can now go onto the Green Infrastructure portal that Natural England have published, and it's incredibly rich and very, very impressive set of data, which I think speaks to many of the points we're talking about, which is how do we make good decisions based on really strong intelligence and spatial information. So I'd really commend that to you. The other thing I just wanted to...
Joanna, is it okay if we finish up so we can start taking questions? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Just one tiny final thing. If colleagues are interested, I had the pleasure of hosting a session on gendered landscapes with colleagues from Sweden and the UK a couple of weeks ago for the with New London Architecture. It's a really interesting lesson for people interested in how we design landscapes for people who might be more concerned about their own personal safety in public space. I would just commend that to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Joanna. I'm sorry to cut in there, but we are fast running out of time, and there are lots and lots of questions that people want to get through. But yeah, bonus points for picking up on some of the questions in the chat box. So first off, Richard Benwell, the Chief Exec of Wildlife and Countryside Link, would like to ask about guidance for accessible natural green space, which was first published by English Nature in 1995. and is now being refreshed by Natural England. Do you agree that it's important to everyone to have access to very local green space? And if so, what should public authorities do to solve the growing inequalities in access to nature? So this one is about very local green space. Next question, I'm going to do them in batches of 3. David Cove, Chair of CPRE West Yorkshire and Chair of Alton and Woodlesford Neighbourhood Forum, would like to ask, we've been told by our local authority in Leeds that many of the green spaces we wanted to include as local green space designations were too small. We've been able to include them as so-called other green spaces, but with less robust protection. Can the panel clarify what can and can't be designated as a local green space? And then lastly, from Susanna from Make Space for Girls, she'd like to know, she's interested in hearing how people see how planning guidance intersects with the public sector equality duty. So yeah, if panelists could keep their remarks and responses as sort of concise as possible. Can we go to Victoria first, please?
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, the question about very local green spaces and what what the local council the local authority can do. This is something that when I read the report, I asked around because I needed to know just what people thought and what we can do to engage with the local authority. And one of the things that confirmed my own beliefs that first of all, we need to make the tools accessible. So it needs to be something that is easy, like I've said before. First of all, the tools, even the research and the designation on the government website is written in a language that is very, you have to be well educated to access. You have to be well educated in the English language to access. Let's not forget, those are 2 different things. And you have to go look for it. First of all, so if the local authority could come to us, come to local community groups, which exist. I mean, there are lots of them, not just walking groups, but women's groups in the community, faith groups, all the groups that already exist. If they could come to us and with a document that is simplified to say, this is what we are thinking of doing. What local green spaces do you have that we might consider designating? But of course, this means that our local authorities will have to be responsible and will have to want to engage. That's always another thing. And I mean, something else is maybe looking at having a clear, strategic plan that the council, has available that we can, with the local community, can say, okay, this is what is happening in our local area this time. And this is what we want to preserve, and this is what we want to engage with. And that would be very useful. I don't want to go back to how important our very local green spaces are, but how we often feel that we cannot engage.
Thanks, Victoria. Madeline, do you want to go next and pick up on as many of the questions as you like?
Sure. I'll try to focus on the first and the second, I think, on what can local authorities do to help when it comes to local green space designation. I think many things have already been said. Obviously, the more they can communicate about this tool, the better, given how little people even just know about it at the moment. As we were doing the research, we also saw a few really good examples of local authorities that did more extensive communication on this, including sometimes developing their own toolkit to support local communities with submitting evidence. I think, as the research shows, there's so far only 20% of the local green spaces designated, that have been designated in local plans. And especially in areas where neighborhood activity is particularly low, there's definitely more opportunities to designate local green spaces in local plans. And that's something that local authorities can really do a lot with. Local green spaces as a designation, they're also a great way for them to support their own local strategic policies around climate, well-being, nature conservation. Yes, I'll be quick. Oh yeah, the second question about, I think it was a local green space that was too small to be considered too small to be designated. As we did the research, there's no real rule for how small a green space can be. I think I found some local green spaces that were sometimes as small as 10 square meters. So really, whatever you might have heard, as far as the evidence shows so far, it's not a thing, I guess. But our estimations show that the average size for a local green space is 1.8 hectares, and its median size is 0.6. The majority of the local green spaces that I found were less than a hectare wide, so that's smaller than Trafalgar Square in London. So they tend to be relatively small. And then in terms of what can or can't be designated as a local green space, as far as the policy goes, what can be designated are areas that are relatively close to where people live. That in itself is a notion that's quite open. We haven't done extensive study on what that means, but I have seen quite a lot of different interpretations. Spaces that are demonstrably special to a local community and that hold a particular local significance. And that can be for a series of reasons, including examples cited in the NPPF, but a lot of other reasons as well. We found examples of spaces that were protected because of their contribution to climate mitigation or adaptation, for example, which is something that the NPPF doesn't specify, and we think it should, to make it clear that it can be a variety of reasons. Spaces that are local in character and that aren't extensive tracts of land. In terms of what can't be designated, the national guidance specifies that it has to be consistent with local plan policies in terms of land identification for development needs. And also spaces that already have planning permission for development will rarely be appropriate, hence the need to really designate spaces as soon as possible if they are valued, because once a planning application has been approved, it will be a lot harder. Thanks.
Thanks, Madeline. That's really helpful clarity. Can we go to Joanna next? And if you could keep your answers as concise as possible, hopefully we can get at least 3 more questions in before we finish at 10.
Thanks, Sarah. All useful points. I mean, I think I'm here to listen. I think what we're getting is really important feedback from how the actual policy is playing out in the real world. So no further comments at this point. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanna. Very concise. And over to you, Sue.
Yeah, no, I'll be brief because obviously there's already been important points made. I think all I'd just say, coming back to Richard's point, is that often communities don't realise what they're about to lose with a green space until it's threatened. And actually what we want to do is look at how we can work, government and local authorities can work more proactively with communities to identify those important local green spaces before there's an issue around planning and before they're threatened, so that they get the protections in good time. And then we don't end up with a fight to save a green space that really shouldn't have been put in that position in the first place.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sue. Okay, we've got more questions to put to you now. So the next one is from Sophie Spencer, who is Director of CPRE Avon and Bristol. And she asks, how can we make it easier for local people and community to utilise the local green space designation, particularly in areas of wealth inequality? Angela Hans, who is actually a civil servant from the Department of Health and Social Care, and it's great that we can have events where we're allowing civil servants to ask civil servants from other departments questions, but what are the panel's thoughts on Natural England's green infrastructure standards and opportunities for developing planning practice guidance separate to that already in existence for natural environments? And then also a question for me, just wanted to jump in with one of my own, if that's okay. We looked a lot at the Levelling Up press release that came through last night, and one of the 12 missions is around well-being, and obviously there's a clear ambition there for the government to reduce health disparities. But if we don't have sufficient investment in and policy support for local planning, especially in the north, we might get the kind of disparities our report has highlighted. So I guess this is a question particularly for Joanna, but what does the LUHC plan to do about that specifically? So maybe I could start with Joanna this time.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for the questions from colleagues across the corridor. So a couple of thoughts. I think what's already sort of in play, is the national planning policy, the national planning policy framework updates in the summer and the National Model Design Code. The really powerful thing about the National Model Design Code is it basically gathered all the latest thinking from across Whitehall, and specifically a wide range of issues, but very specifically to this point, it reflects all the aspects of biodiversity net gain and the other aspects that sort of start to come through the Environment Act. So it is a really good starting point, and I'm not saying that just for the sake of it. Genuinely, it does give a huge array of references and material, and design coding is now something that local authorities with communities are strongly encouraged to do. And to support that, we've already been working with 14 pilots sort of over the summer, local authorities who have been looking at the National Model Design Code, its application in their communities, and starting to test it for themselves. And we also in the summer put a call out for further local authorities to be involved in then developing sort of full codes, which will address sort of all of these issues. So I would just really, commend that document, and our objective is very much to sort of share as we gather best practice and learning from those local authorities much more widely. And public space is obviously sort of very much at the heart of that. And also the sort of strength that was put into sustainable development and nature within the updates to the NPPF. So we're not there yet. There's lots more to do. It's obviously an emerging area of focus, and the planning system has absolutely its part to play in terms of climate adaptation, journey to net zero, and how we actually deal with all these issues going forward. On the Levelling Up white paper specifically, then. Yes, neighbourhood planning has a really important role to play, and also health and well-being. And so, yes, I just agree with the point that, planning will be playing its part in terms of these wider agendas as set out in the Levelling Up white paper. It's one of our key levers and tools as practitioners, as communities, to bring about positive change. And, planning will be part of that. Thanks.
Thanks, Joanna. Can I ask one specific question? Will we be receiving a kind of planning bill or a levelling up bill that includes planning clauses, or is that sort of still TBC?
That's TBC, Sarah. That'll be announced in due course.
Great, thanks, Joanna. Okay, can we go to Sue next, please?
Thanks. Yeah, I think the health part of it is really important within the levelling up. I mean, I talked about the crossover between DEFRA and DLUC, but obviously it brings other departments in, health being obviously a really critical one. And I think what the levelling up agenda can do is actually try and join these kind of disparate departments together in some way, because government and departments are just too siloed, they don't talk to each other enough. But actually, because levelling up, I mean, really, you can make it whatever you want it to be. It covers everything. So it does bring an opportunity to pull things together. And that includes how we do planning, what we consider to be important in maintaining health. And obviously green spaces is something that has become increasingly recognised as something that is important. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities as we look more into what the Levelling Up White Paper can bring us, and how we can kind of push for the importance of these protections to be part of it. Just looking at Sophie's question really quickly about how easy it is for people to use designation, I think it's never particularly easy for people, for normal people, rather than people actually working, lay people, if you like, to find their way through any kind of government application for any kind of opportunity. I think it's, Victoria talked about the accessibility of the language. So I do think it's really important that local authorities and government are more proactive about it and explain to local communities what the opportunities are, and actually then work with them to make the most of the opportunities that are available that they may simply not be aware of.
Thank you very much, Sue. Can we go to Victoria next, please?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm going to respond to Sophie's question because that's directly related to us. And like I've said before, the local authorities and people involved in planning can, like Sue said, be more proactive. But sometimes the feeling is that they don't want to be. The feeling is that we've got to constantly fight, but we don't know what as Sue said earlier, we don't know what we should be fighting for, because say, for example, you have a playing field that you're using, you take it for granted that it's protected, that is designated, that nothing is going to happen to it until you start to see signboards go up. And then it's too late to fight for it, because you cannot put a designation on, you cannot use a designation tool then. The onus is on the local authority, not on communities, because they know what is going to be happening, they know what already exists. And to make it easier, I mean, to even start with, let's say a tool set on the local authority website that like you do with the bins thing, you can go and request a new bin. Something like as easy as request to designate a local green space, a drop-down box where you just literally just tick the reasons, tick the importance. If you want to add more information in words, you can. But what this does is that it makes the language very easy for people to understand. Even if you don't have to read anything to know anything, to say, this is my postcode, and this is the local green space that I am concerned about. Something that simple. Another thing could be, really a physical engagement. Once in a while, it would be nice to see someone come along to a local green space in my neighborhood with leaflets and just say, talk to people that are using it, young people, women, parents, dog walkers. Do you use this often? What do you think this means to you? And just get that sense, that feeling that, this community uses this space, so maybe we need to do something about it. Leaflets in different languages. I get stuff from my local authority put through my door that I don't find useful when I look at it, but then I come back and look at it and thought, actually, maybe I should respond to this. That can be also very, very powerful way of engaging. I think the most important thing is the local authority to show that it wants to engage with the local community.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm sorry to cut in there, but we are nearly at 10 o'clock now, so I just wanted to offer Madeline the final word before we wrap up.
Thanks, Sarah. Just to say really quickly on the question around facilitating the designation of local green spaces in areas of inequality, to reiterate the need to further support neighborhood planning, especially in regions of the north and in urban areas, with additional funding for these deprived areas is really, really key to maximize the local green space designation. And then also in response to the question around Natural England's green infrastructure, to reiterate that it is one of our recommendations as part of this report to introduce compulsory standards for access to nature into planning law and policy, and that could be based on Natural England's data set as an example. Thank you.
Thanks, Madeline. And yeah, just to wrap up, thank you so much to the panelists, Joanna, Victoria, Sue and Madeline, and that was absolutely brilliant. And to everyone that's joined this morning and for all the fantastic questions. In terms of next steps, CPRE convenes the Better Planning Coalition, and we're going to be doing a lot of work with the sector more broadly on the MPPF and the planning bill / levelling up bill when it emerges. And also just sort of promoting local green space as much as possible through our local groups so that more local communities can make use of it. But yeah, sorry for running over slightly, but thank you for a great event, and have a good day. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.